Okay.
It's still working its way over there. Okay, now we're good.
All right. Then I'll call us into session at 5:02 p.m. Thanks everybody for coming. This is a full house tonight. Do we have any modifications or additions to the agenda?
President Efford, there are none recommended from staff.
Okay. And in public comment, the written comment, Genevieve, did you want to put that on the screen? Or could we all just?
Sure, yep. It's, I don't have any commentary about it. It is a written comment that was received since the last meeting. The topic of each of those letters enclosed in your packet touches on the potential weight limit restriction on the bridge and its impact to those local businesses.
Okay, and I'd like to say, towards those things, can you get back to those authors of those letters? I thought they were all thoughtful and well written, and provide them with contact information for our state legislatures.
Yes.
And ask them to forward same letters to them.
John, good point. I've responded to both of those and other businesses, and we have a communication link or group of the businesses that utilize the bridge, and I want to make sure they're aware of it and they're spreading the word. But that's a good suggestion. We'll make sure that they have an opportunity to contact our legislators.
Yeah, I think I said state, but I meant federal.
Okay.
Yeah.
And on top, along those lines, would we want to go a step further in knowing that we know some of the other businesses that are impacted by the weight? Maybe getting some sort of joint letter from all of them that could go to the various people?
That could be a one gorge combination letter, Genevieve.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what that platform is for.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. And moving on, we have bridge replacement presentation. Mr. Mike Fox.
Okay, hold on 1 second and I'll get that. Did you want to speak before the presentation begins, Mr.
No,
Fox?
go ahead and put the
Okay.
first slide up. While she's doing that, hey, thanks for taking the time to have me present this to you. A few of you folks have sought me out over the last year to talk about issues with the bridge, and I've listened to them. I've talked to a number of people, and I've come up with some observations that I'd like to show and share with you. Please stop me at any time if you've got any questions or you want to discuss something. Be more than happy to do that. If you could go to the next slide, please. So my background, as this slide indicates, I've got lots and lots of years of experience in heavy engineering construction, but also in programs. And a couple of them that I'd like to highlight to you that I think is kind of apropos to what you're doing here is working with the U.S. Department of Energy on some environmental remediation projects up at Hanford. There we're in competition with lots and lots of other programs and projects across the U.S. to try and attract funding, and it's multi-year funding. I was part of a very small team that came up with an idea, a strategy. It's called the 100 and 300 area closure strategy, which we were able to work with the EPA and Washington Department of Ecology, gained their support for this, and allowed us to attract literally hundreds of millions of dollars per year over the course of the program, and kept the funding coming. And what this strategy really entailed was cleaning up major areas of land near the river and working our way away from the river, and then allowing the release of that land back for alternate uses. It was very successful, and that particular program now is done. Another one that I think is somewhat apropos is work that I did over in the UK with a very small group of professionals. And we worked for the Department of Trade and Industry and helped them establish the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, which is kind of like a Department of Energy environmental management organization for the UK. Had 13 sites all across the program. And it was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 to 180 billion pounds. So you take dollar times 1.5, that's a pound. So I was very much involved in that. Likewise, over in the UK, I was the chief executive officer for the UK DE&S program. It's a program that basically is responsible for buying all equipment for the military. I was responsible for the air and the fleet domain and helping that organization really change the way they executed work and the way they dealt with contractors to make it more efficient and get more bang for the pound. That was an equivalent 4-star position, both of them. And I was there for about 3 years. Lastly, Bechtel Corporate. I was corporate manager of project controls, responsible for worldwide work, worldwide procedures, process, and training of staff. And I had about 2,400 employees working for me worldwide. Part of that, I had to go to every one of the Bechtel projects worldwide and review execution and progress and performance on that. Lastly, I was elected a vice president, which put me in the top 100, 110 people of a 50,000 employee company. I then retired in 2017, and I think this shows that I think I'm probably experienced enough to bring some thoughts and ideas to you folks. Next slide, please. Some concerns that I've had talking to some of your people and observing what has been going on. And you know, I've been unofficially working with Kevin as his mentor for several years now. He's kept me somewhat up to date on progress that's being made and approaches being used. And again, talking with a couple of the port commissioners and listening to the concerns and so on, I developed this list of observations associated with the bridge replacement effort. First one is, I think the bridge is probably deteriorating faster than you expected. If you could go back to the previous, yep. Another issue that I've got, no one has really said when the bridge must be replaced. I think that's a very key one, and we're going to talk some more about that here in a minute. The current replacement approach appears to be very sequential and may not be supporting the needs of the replacement. The pace of the replacement effort is likely too slow, and efforts to attract the funding, while started, are not, I don't think, are sufficient. And I'll spend a little time with that with you on as well. The current management of the effort really doesn't have mega project experience. It's okay for the NEPA, okay for the short-term work efforts, but I think is lacking real clear experience that you're going to need for your program long-term. And lastly, another observation is I don't know really who's driving this effort. It just doesn't come across that there's a single person in charge and is really working to execute this project in an expeditious manner. Next slide, please. Key question that I really have, and I wish you would really think about, when does a bridge have to be further derated or replaced? It drives everything in your program. When do you have to have your permits in place? When do you have to award a contract? When does the contract have to be finished? When do you have to start this? When do you have to finish that? I don't know of any schedule that you have that really shows that need as being defined. You know, the answer to this is not easy to derive. It's really going to require an unbiased engineering evaluation and a realistic economic evaluation, because the engineering evaluation will say, hey, you've got a bridge that's degrading and you're going to have to do this to it to prop it back up. And you got to have an economic evaluation to decide whether you can really afford to do it. Now, I know that you went through this about 4 or 5 years ago, but I would really encourage you to get that updated and take a fresh look at where are you today. Has the bridge deteriorated faster than what you thought? What's it look like, 3, 4, 5 years down the road? Are you on track? Are you going faster? Are you going slower? If you go to the next slide, please. So I came up with this, what I call a 9-component strategy. There's no real priority sequence here. And I've shared a version of this with Kevin a couple of months ago, and he actually provided some input, as did, I think, Mr. Green that works for Kevin. The first one I'd like to talk to you about is determining the need of sense of urgency. Okay, that really comes back to what we talked about. When does the bridge need to be further derated or replaced? Without that, you really don't know where you are. If this evaluation says you're good for another 30, 40 years, hey, relax, you're fine. If the bridge says, if this study says you really need to get it done in the next 10 years, you guys are in big trouble right now. So it's determining the need for a sense of urgency. And it's really going to require some real tough decisions by you guys, sticking your neck out a little bit, but it's got to be done. And then if things change, you can always change it, but you got to put a stake in the ground. And I think it's probably going to say you need to replace it quicker than what perhaps you're thinking you are. That's going to drive everything you do. The second one I want to talk to you about is standing up a management organization that supports you, and it's your arms and legs in this entire effort. And I think that management organization has got to be driven by a project manager, project director that's very qualified in this kind of work. I think this organization too should be made up of half a dozen at peak to maybe a dozen people, and it covers all different types of operations, from project management to project engineering, has some dealings with constructability, procurement, contracting, safety. There's a number of things that I mentioned in the write-up. All of these are not required immediately, and they'll vary over time as your project progresses. One thing to be aware of, your project manager and some of these other people, you're going to get sticker shock on what it's going to cost you. If you think you can get these folks cheap, you get what you pay for. So I would encourage you to be very careful in the selection of this. Get the right type of person in here that can really drive this whole program. This program should report, I believe, up to you as the commissioners, and just as I think Kevin talks to you folks every meeting, this manager, whatever you want to call them, director, should be doing the same thing. We talked a little bit, and we're going to talk some more about volunteers. The volunteer organization, if you choose to use them, I think is a perfect fit for tucking up under this management organization. As long as you've got a project director, project manager that's really qualified, that'll work just fine. Next one is finalize the EIS and the rod installation. You guys are well along your way. You've got it pretty well structured, as I can see. It's moving along. A couple of things to watch out for here. Part of it, if you go back to the previous slide, please. One of the things that's missing right now is that the original approach, as I remember, Kevin, had WSP providing some preliminary early design and a first project estimate. I understand that has been moved out, pushed out, and you may be considering putting it back in. I would encourage you to do that. Right now, you don't have an estimate for your project for this bridge. So how do you know how much money you need? And this estimate needs to be very well qualified. There's things that you know, there's things that you don't know. That all needs to be taken into consideration. And that estimate needs to be maintained through the life of the project. So the smarter you get, the better the number gets. But it should be a transfer of money from contingency into what we call directs and back and forth. So I would encourage you on item number 3, get that early design done and get an estimate performed. Item number 4 is a big one. It's massive. Attract needed funding. I think it's something that I would really encourage you to spend a lot more calories on thinking through this thing. And I think it's a combination of not only working with the states as you're doing now on the federal to try and attract funding, but it's getting a massive community involvement program going on to drive the support of this. This is something we did up at Hanford with the closure strategy. You need something like that for your bridge. And maybe you've got it. I haven't seen it. I haven't heard anything about it on the magnitude that it needs. The other thing I would encourage you right now, you've got about $5 million this year, $5 million next year. You guys, you got to think much bigger than that. You ought to be looking at chunks of $30 to $40 million to get design done and $300 to $400 million to get your construction done. So it's a massive project. And if you're looking at it, 5 million here, 5 million there, unless this bridge is good for another 30 years, you're going to be in trouble. Okay. Item number 5, define need for limited design work to better define the project. I think that comes out of item number 3. You need to be able to define your project sufficient enough that you can get good bids and good procurement discussions as you go further. I think, you're looking at your P3 program right now. I don't know how much more definition you need for a P3. You probably got enough coming out of your documents for your EIS for a P3. For a design bid or design bid build, there's probably a little bit more that you need to be able to give a good, solid request for quotes in a scope document there. So something that you need to think about. Item 6 is evaluate the best approach. Right now, you're looking at this P3 thing, but if you don't have a schedule that's defined that shows when that bridge needs to be replaced, how do you know when you have to make that P3 decision? Working backwards from the end of your schedule. You don't. So that's a problem. I think as you go through your P3, I would not be surprised at all that you reject that approach because what will end up happening is you're going to have such high bridge tolls to pay for it. I think you would have a real problem with the local community paying that kind of a price. But you got to evaluate and select the best approach for both of these design and construction pieces of it. Word of caution, and it sounds like when I looked at the rest of your package today, there was some discussion on it earlier and you listened. I would encourage you not to do a whole bunch of small little contracts on design, like design 15% and then stop and then think about it and go off for bid for another piece of it and stop, then go off for bid for another piece. That's just in my experience, it's a waste of money, a huge waste of time because your follow-on contractors, if it's not awarded to the same one, will probably throw it out and start over anyway because of risk and liability. So it sounds like what you're trying to do is a complete design related contract with off ramps. We used to call them CLIN, contract line item numbers in the government business, where you use a CLIN to identify a chunk of work that you have funding for, and there's an off ramp. If you can't get funding for subsequent work, you just stop. So that allows you to have continuity of the contractor, and it looks like that's what Mr. Green is suggesting to you, and I think that's a good idea. Number 7, define, procure, and award and execute necessary bridge contracts. Sounds really easy. This is a big chunk of work. It will likely take you 3 to 6 months just to get a package ready to go for issuance for bid. One of the things that you really want to watch out for on this type of a project, it's a big project, so you're going to have a lot of different contractors coming after you to bid on the contract. If you haven't thought through and your documents are not really tight and in control, if you don't have a very good process for evaluating bids and making a selection, you could very easily get a couple of contractors that protest your award, which then throws you into legal challenges. And that legal challenges cost you money, but it also costs you time. And if you have this sense of urgency that's driven by your completion date that you have to have the replacement bridge in place, that just puts more pressure on you that you don't need. So you got to have this management organization in place with experience in contracting and so on to make sure that your documents are well structured and your process is well thought out. Item number 8 is determine and execute plan for decommissioning of the bridge. This could be rolled into number 7, or it could be a standalone. But one of the things I think you ought to be thinking about is how can you make it attractive? Could you attract contractors to come in and at least give you partial credit for demolishing the bridge by reusing the steel on it? We did this very successfully up at Hanford, where we had huge tanks that we had to cut apart and get rid of. Some of the tanks were actually contaminated, and we ended up working a structure out where we decontaminated the structure, and we had a contractor come in and cut it apart and take it out, and they actually paid the federal government to do that. So there's ways that you can do that and maybe save you some money. And item number 9 is an obvious one too. Who's going to own this bridge long term, and how are you going to manage it? Now, that could be rolled into item number 2, but maybe not. Maybe you're not ready to have that discussion yet. But at some point in time, you're going to have to figure that out. Next slide, please. So these 9 component strategies, you can either work them sequentially, one before the next. When you do that, you tend to have surprises in that those activities get started too late. Now that gets magnified if you have a schedule that you really don't have tied to an end date that you have to have the bridge replaced by. Everything just floats to the right. So you may be surprised that in this sequential approach, you don't have enough time to get things done. So it may not support the replacement need. Parallel or staggered approach is where you're working several of these components at the same time. If you do that, it's going to limit surprises that could have catastrophic impacts on your project end date, and will more likely get your bridge replaced sooner than the sequential approach. Next slide, please. Okay, so call for action. I would urge you to prioritize evaluating the current health of the bridge. Get that previous study updated, get new studies, whatever you need to get a real good picture of what's the health of that bridge and help you make a decision on when replacement has to be in place, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. You really need to have a document that you can hang your hat on and use it and monitor it yearly to see how things are progressing. Once you decide what that date is, I would encourage you to back up or accelerate that date by at least 6 months and wholeheartedly, if not a year, because things are going to happen to your project and things are going to slip. And if you set that date all the way to the absolute dead date, you're probably going to miss it. I would encourage you to, as the commissioners, to either agree or change, but take ownership of this 9-component strategy. Make it your own and really guard it and drive your program to make sure that all of these components are being worked properly. I'd urge you to get a qualified management contract organization in place to help guide you. You know, you've got this BiState commission could very easily be rolled up into this particular organization. Maybe you could second some folks from ODOT and Washington DOT into this program. You've got folks right on staff that you could use this approach as a career development opportunity for them. I've one person that just impressed me was Ann, who I believe is on this this video conference. When I sat through some of your meetings years ago, she really impressed me with what she knew of her projects and so on. I think she would be excellent to join this particular organization. It would really allow her to grow. But I think there's a way that you could roll multiple people into this organization, perhaps not cost you a whole bunch of money, but something to strongly consider. I would really urge you to construct a project milestone summary schedule and obtain a well-documented estimate. And it's all tied back to when does that bridge have to be replaced. You've got schedules now, but it's not tied to anything. So you don't know when it slips, what's the impact on the end date of having a bridge in place. And then I would encourage you to work the strategy components in parallel, and likewise, it's okay to be ahead of schedule. You know, get it done. I would encourage the port commissioners to really drive the effort, ask questions, seek responses, hold people accountable. I would encourage you that, and if a litmus test that I've had when I go to various projects around the world, if I hear everybody in agreement 100% of the time, then there's something wrong. Somebody's not being open and forthright and talking about the real projects, because guess what? Every program of this size is going to have major projects or problems and issues. And a successful project is how you deal with those things. And if everybody's saying, yes, everything's fine, then either you don't know or you're lying to yourself. So I would encourage you, be careful of that. Lastly, last slide. Oh, I guess it's second to last. Using volunteers. You know, I tried to sit down for a few seconds and what's the pros and the cons. And obviously, pros, if you get the right volunteers, they can add experience and insight into your program and your project team that maybe they don't have. Could increase the community advocacy for the project. Certainly increases the visibility of the community on your ongoing efforts and approaches. That's at least some of the pros. The cons, if you're not careful, it increases visibility of the community as what's going on in approaches. So if you got a lousy approach and things aren't going right, community's going to hear about it much earlier than they would otherwise. If you don't carefully chosen to manage, the involvement may impede progress. I think I watched your videotape of your last meeting, and you know, I agree with what some of the commissioners were saying, a concern about where does this volunteer report to? To me, organizationally, it belongs under the management organization, that strategy component number 2. I'm going to tell you straight up, it does not belong reporting to Kevin. I like Kevin as a person. I think Kevin's doing an okay job with the NEPA process, but with all due respect, he is nowhere near qualified to do what you're about to start to do, in my opinion. So if you've got a qualified manager driving that management organization, having the volunteers report there is just fine. In fact, I think very appropriate. I also took a look at your draft volunteer agreement. I got to tell you guys, that's one of the worst documents I've ever seen in my life. As the message you're sending to people when you send that thing out is, it's very clear you don't want volunteer help. So, I mean, if you do, you ought to take that and throw it away and start over, and be very careful how you word it. Last slide. Some closing thoughts. You know, I've seen lots and lots of projects and programs the world over. Executing these large projects using luck and momentum generally doesn't lead to success. And I think you're a little better than this right now, but not a lot. And I'm telling you straight out, I'm not mincing words with you. I'm telling you like I see it. You got some work to do on your program. I would encourage you to plan the work, then work the plan. So really think through the program, like these 9 categories. Think through those, get a plan together, and then go work it. There's a term here, go slow to go fast. This is something that it's in Bechtel. It's a Foxism. I actually started it. And I got into all kinds of trouble with the execs when I first put it out on the table, because it basically, the way they initially took it is, slow down, take it easy, have a break, have a coffee. So no. What it means is go slow to go fast. So what I mean by this is think through your program, get yourself organized, get the right people involved, and then drive like hell. So it's go slow to go fast. And lastly, I would urge you, and especially the commissioners, manage the program like you hopefully drive a car. Focus your whole approach to looking down the road. Proactively look down the road and address problems before they arise. So let me ask you, do you drive the car looking at the hood ornament? If you do that, you're probably going to run into the car in front of you. If you drive the car looking down the road, quarter of a mile, half a mile, the likelihood of you hitting a car is a lot less. Well, driving a program like this is exactly the same. So I would encourage you to, for the program directors or the commissioners, think out a year, 2 years down the road. Pay a little bit of attention to what's going on now. Do your sanity checks, but make sure you got people that are looking that far out. If you do, you have a much better chance of having a very successful program. And I'd just like to close to you folks. I wish you all the luck. The community and I are really anxiously waiting you guys getting our new bridge built, because I personally think it's very dangerous. Regardless of the structure itself, you know, the width of that bridge is no good. And I think it's probably degrading faster than maybe you recognize. So I just don't want anybody to get hurt on that bridge. And I know you don't either. So with that, that's my presentation. Does any of you have any questions?
Okay, Mike, Mr. Fox, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Routinely, we don't take any we don't do any discussion at a presentation because we may deliberate it down the road, but we do carefully listen. And I'd like to, thank you for the considerable amount of work that you obviously put into it. I would like to say that as both the port representative to the BiState working group and a commissioner during the NEPA effort, I am very comfortable with the work that Kevin has accomplished. And when we started in 2018, Clickitat County, White Salmon, Bingen, all declined to participate. They wrote a letter to that effect, said we don't want to play. And contrast that to now, where we have a very vibrant BiState working group in effect, that's been Kevin's work. Kevin made that happen today. Real accomplishment, real progress. And I think that's exactly the skill set we need for where we are.
You're absolutely right. I have no argument with that. I think he's done a nice job up to today. But I believe, and again, no disrespect to Kevin, he's not the guy for you going forward with the rest of this project, in my opinion, based on all of the experience that I've got. I think Kevin's done a nice job of what has been accomplished this far. But my opinion.
As you say, and thank you for your opinion.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
John,
Yes.
one question, because I thought that we were bringing Mr. Fox in here to have a bit more of a discussion. So you're saying now that that can't happen?
Well, we don't usually because we're likely to deliberate. I mean, I'm not hard and fast on it. Do you have a question that you think deserves an answer or needs one?
Well, I mean, the presentation I think was very good. I mean, what my anticipation of bringing Mr. Fox to having a better seat, not necessarily at the commission table, but just in the process is, there's things like, for example, in tonight's packet, we have this report from Mr. Green, and I know we'll be getting to that later in the meeting, and, but when I read the report from Mr. Green, everything sounds beautiful and it sounds very well thought out. It sounds very great, but also it's totally out of my wheelhouse. And I don't know what I don't know. And it's documents like that and it's presentations like that I think having Mr. Fox weigh in on it, whether we agree or disagree or decide to move one way or another, it's documents like that I would just love to have more opinions on, to make sure that we're doing this as efficiently and cost effectively as possible, to get it as quickly done as possible.
I mean, I understand what you said, but that's what we do when we vet the people that we listen to for input and professionalism. We vet them up front, and those are the opinions that we use to guide our decision. To then second guess every decision we get from our consultants is much like, going to a doctor and not taking his advice. If you need to second guess these people, they're the wrong people. We don't want them on board.
Right, but we as a commission currently, I mean, Mr. Fox may or may not have read it. I'm not sure if he read Mr. Green's letter in our packet, but he might wholeheartedly agree with them and say, this is good and this is the right path. And that could give the commission confidence that we're not wasting time, energy, and money on this project. I think that's just kind of what I was thinking would be helpful for the whole community to know, yes, we're going down this path, and there's other professionals, this volunteer organization that, because there's other persons in our community that have amazing experience similar to Mr. Fox's. And this volunteer group also says, we give this a thumbs up. And
well, yeah, there are, I think Kevin said, I talked to him this morning, that there may be, a dozen people that are, competent, qualified, that have input to the process, interest in the project that he talks to. I mean, what you're suggesting, Christy, to me sounds like management by committee, where we can never get to a decision. And that's why we vet and hire the people that are on our team. I don't know how your confidence would be increased by listening to 12 more opinions.
I think that my confidence would be increased is if we receive a letter from a consultant and we also have this volunteer committee that says, yes, this is good.
Well, but then, so, practically, that means we get a letter, we pass it to this volunteer committee who are volunteers, all have their own lives. Then they spend time vetting the letter and coming to us with an opinion. And we have the committee and our paid staff or consultant argue both of their perspectives on point by point. And we make a decision. That's our job, is to get good people on board to accomplish this project. I'm satisfied that we have good people on board and not accidentally.
Commissioners, very quickly, this is a public comment portion of our meeting, and we have members of our constituency that have, shared their time with us this evening to make comment. I don't know that, while this is an important discussion, I really think that we should be listening to our constituents right now and then discussing what we need to perhaps later. This is the public comment time, which is time for us to listen.
Yeah, agreed. And Christy, I don't mean to cut you off. If you want to have more of this, let's put it on the agenda for another meeting and we can talk it through more.
Commissioner Everett, can we, just suggestion, would it be possible that we have a work session so we can get some more clarity far as all 5 commissioners are on the same page in the same direction and feel comfortable moving forward with this major project? I think Mr. Fox has brought some good points to light tonight, and he's brought some questions that maybe we've underestimated the size and magnitude of this project. And like Mike's saying, do it right the first time. So just a suggestion, but I would be willing to take my time and have a work session and have Mike reappear and as a guest, and we can bounce things off him. I think he's a wealth of knowledge. I'm totally impressed. I think Mr. Fox approaches business like I do. I feel comfortable with it, but I would like to go to a work session so we're all on the same page. I think we're kind of fragmented right now. Just a suggestion.
Okay. Let's see then. Commissioner Merriweather, can you weigh in on a work session?
Yes, and let me apologize to all of you, including Mr. Fox. I had a prior engagement that I really had to meet, so I was late getting in and missed an awful lot of it. But yes, if I support doing a work session if that's what the commission wants to do, I would go along with that.
Okay. Mr. Chapman, I assume you'd be in favor. Mr. Shepherd.
Yes, thank
I am, and I hope we would invite Mr. Fox to join us, and I think his thoughts would be very valuable.
Okay, then, yeah, of course we can. And Michael, could you set that up? We kind of look for, I guess, I don't know when it would be. Maybe come back with suggestions for times and dates.
Yeah, we'll do so. That sounds like a February timeframe, working around the existing commission meeting on the 16th. We'll send out some dates via email.
Okay. All right. Well.
Okay, thank you all. I'm going to bail off. Thank you, and sure, I'd be happy to.
All right, Mr.
Thanks,
Fox.
Mike. Appreciate it.
All right, bye.
And then next up would be the consent agenda. Does anybody like to take anything off the consent agenda down into discussion? In that case, can I get a motion?
This is Merriweather, and I move approval of consent agenda.
Shepherd,
Chapman
second.
can,
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor?
Chapman, aye.
Meriwether, aye.
Shepherd, aye.
Oh, you're muted.
Strike aye.
Yeah, Everett, aye. Passes. The informational reports. And first up would be the financial report for the 6 months ended December 31st.
John, Commissioner Everett, these are just for information. If a commissioner wants to pull it down and for more discussion, that's prerogative.
Yes, I'm sorry. My mistake. Although at the end of this section, Michael told me, Genevieve, that there's a good photograph of the BiState working group.
Yeah, I'll share that with you. This is, we had an ad opportunity with Business Oregon Magazine. Their February issue is their economic development issue. And they had an open spot, gave us a bargain. So we took a 2-page spread and just wanted to show you the proof that we got from it today. This is a group photo that is all of the elected officials that serve on the BiState working group. Yourself, President Everett, and White Salmon Mayor Marla Kiefler, Hood River County Commissioner Bob Benton, Hood River Mayor Kate McBride, Klickitat County Commissioner Jacob Anderson, and Bingen Mayor Betty Barnes. And I'll zoom out so you can see the full spread. And it's a really, really well-written article. Kevin and Michael were really helpful in pulling this together in a week's time. So thank you to those guys and to everybody on the team.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great photo. Yeah. So now, presentation and discussion items. I guess first up is going to be the airport commercial hangar.
And I think you're muted.
Sorry, hold on, let me get there in my, okay, so as part of the commission direction to take the next steps towards development of a commercial hangar, staff has been working with Aaron Fagery, who's an architect, as you know, who works a lot with airports. And both he and also John Mann have suggested, and I agree, in looking at some different ways to contract this type of building. This is a different sort of building than we've built recently, pretty straightforward, and could very well benefit from a different contracting method than the typical method that we use, which is, you know, lowest bidder sort of process. So Jerry has brought on David Doofman from Portland, who is an attorney who specializes in contracts. And he's here really to help us sort of work through the options. Anything that's different from the typical bidding process that we use would have to be exempted by you through our processes. And so I think from here, I'll turn it over to Mr. Doofman just to talk a little bit about the different processes. And then John is here tonight too to talk with you. He's got a lot of experience in this types of contracting in Washington State. So with that, thank you, Mr. Doofman, and I'll turn it over to you.
And if I may, Commissioner Strike, and do we possibly have a map of that location that we can bring up?
Oh yeah, sure.
Genevieve?
I'll send it to Genevieve and get it up there. Just a second. Do you just want to see like a Google map?
Yeah, just give us a reference where it's at, the size, and that.
Okay.
Part.
Okay.
Thank you, Ann. Sorry.
Just give me a second and I'll get it.
Okay. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ann. Nice to be with you all this evening. I was able to briefly chat with Sherry, I guess, late last week. Our firm is, Chris Crane in our office has been doing some work for the port with Jerry, and Chris passed on my experience in these alternative contracting delivery methods that Ann referenced. So just by way of brief background, if you already sort of have some familiarity with our firm, I apologize for being redundant, but it's Beery, Elsner & Hammond is a law firm that I'm with, and we're a relatively small outfit in Portland. We limit our practice to local government clients, or government clients, mostly local government clients in Oregon and Washington. My focus over 20 years now has been public contracting and land use issues. That's where I tend to do most of my work, and have a great deal of background in construction work specifically, and then getting even sort of more detailed into alternatives to the typical design, bid, build, and award to the lowest responsible bidder that really drives the foundation for construction contracting in Oregon anyway. So I understand with the Hangar project that there's at least interest, and I will admit, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm not sure how far along the port is in terms of thinking about these issues, but and perhaps using design build delivery method to get that the hangar built, designed and built. And so it is a very increasingly common method. In Oregon, I suppose maybe a little bit in terms of how states approach these types of non-traditional construction delivery methods is maybe a little bit behind the curve. In Oregon, it's still, if you're not going to be doing the design it and then bid it and then build it, you have to go through, as Ann mentioned, an exemption process, which is maybe a little less onerous than it might seem, but there are a number of steps that have to happen. And so I thought I would just sort of describe that a little bit. It would be applicable, these steps would be applicable whether you're going to do design build, whether you do something like a CMGC, and design build operate. I mean, there's all sorts of different, alternative ways to deliver construction projects. And for better or worse in Oregon, if you're going to do any of those, you've first got to get an exemption in place. So what that really amounts to is having, well, there's sort of two components to it. One would be having a hearing before you as commissioners. And that's really just a matter of taking testimony from anybody that would be interested in commenting on some findings that the commission would ultimately have to adopt if it wanted to proceed with, let's say, a design build delivery method. And we kind of work backwards from the date of the hearing, because at least 14 days in advance, the port staff would give notice in the statute refers to a trade journal of general circulation in the state, which is really the DJC. If you're familiar with that trade newspaper, it's really the kind of the for construction, people in construction and design, it's kind of the biggest journal in the state. So we'd put a notice, one notice, at least 14 days in advance of the hearing, just to say that the port would be considering these findings, may exempt this contract. You're welcome to submit testimony at this time and place. And the findings themselves have to be in draft form and available for inspection at the date that you advertise. So, if this is of interest to the commission, and you want to explore that or ultimately, do it, the step we'd need to take first is just really identifying a date for that hearing. And Jerry and I, when we talked, thought initially that it may be the first meeting that you would have in February. And unfortunately for my schedule, when you start working backwards and getting findings drafted, that would almost result, by the time we need to get advertising copy to the DJC in a set of findings due, I think it would be Thursday, the day after tomorrow. So that's just a little too aggressive of a time frame based on other commitments that I have. Certainly, you know, if there were an interest in doing this in the March meeting or having a special meeting, Jerry mentioned that might be a possibility as well. But we can certainly accommodate that. So I'm not sure how much more the commission would want to hear from me about this. I'm happy to answer any questions and certainly can get more specific about the process or, you know, what experience I've had over the years.
I'd like to ask a question if I could. And I guess going back a step, what are the advantages of CMGC or design build as opposed to the traditional design bid build? And why would that be applicable with regard to the hangar as opposed to any other capital project we might do?
So some of that's going to depend upon information about the hangar and the you know, the uses that it's going to be put to, needs perhaps that, you know, you get it up and running by a certain date if you have leasehold commitments, et cetera. And candidly, Commissioner, I don't know that level of detail with regard to the project, but oftentimes, at least in a design build context, you can deliver a complete project, you know, on orders of magnitude much faster than you would through a traditional design, then bid, then build. You're essentially having, well, not essentially, you have one point of responsibility. More often than not, it is they usually have worked together in the past. It can be one firm sometimes, but often it will be an architectural firm and a general contractor that pair and would give you a proposal. And that entity, if you will, would begin a design process. You might have a very preliminary sort of scope and idea of what you want to see in the hangar, let's say. And they would begin, and so there would be one point of responsibility for design and construction. By doing so, given that sort of, you know, intimate working relationship, you can often have early work that starts. You might not even have a complete design yet when they would actually, you know, break ground and begin construction. So each project's different, and that's why I say that the sort of the specifics of this one would really drive a complete answer to your question. But that's the general idea.
And then if I may too, Commissioner Merriweather, as I understand it, with a design build type option, typically it's a pretty straightforward building. It's a hangar that will likely use a metal, like a steel package that comes in a kit. And the different manufacturers and contractors that use those have a specific way that they put it together. So if we generate all the specifications, we then are limiting our flexibility to what kind of kits can fit in those specifications. We would generate some, but not all. We would generate enough to get the design components and the detail we need, but we would be flexible enough to encourage a bunch of different types of building kits. And in this specific sort of straightforward, simple building design, we feel that we would get more competition and a better field with this type of contract as well. But again, if there's any questions specifically about that, I've never actually done a design build, but John has, and he's here to answer any of those specific construction related questions.
I guess in that scenario, we are negotiating directly with a contractor since we're not bidding it out. And so we would be, I guess, working out the pricing to some extent as we go during the construction process. Would that be accurate?
You would still do a standard bid process. So I think we have a couple different things going on here. We would do a standard bid process, either an RFP or an invitation to bid, depending on what kind of contract we wanted to use. And then these are just the different contracting types. So it's a very similar bid process with just a different contract resulting from that process.
You would most likely do an RFP. That's pretty typical. And so one of the advantages of that is if you get the exemption in place, approve the findings, then using that RFP as your solicitation, you have the ability to deviate, if you will, from just solely driven by the lowest responsible bidder, which is really the low bid. It's price, and that's great. In most cases, that's not an issue. In some cases, you want to have more flexibility in terms of having, I guess, more to consider qualifications or a qualitative analysis of who you'd select as well, and so that would allow for that.
Thank you.
Would this kind of process and situation also be appropriate for simple buildings like for the Odell property? Is this something, Anne, that you think that we might be a better fit than the process that or the path that we were kind of on previously at looking at those?
Potentially, I mean, this would just sort of open up a whole different bidding process and alternate for us. And then we could determine based on the project, which would be the better fit. We would then have experience and processes in place to be able to do this. And it would just give us more options in how we wanted to bid. And in the end, hopefully, cost us less and be, quicker projects and successful.
Well, having worked with steel kit manufacturers, I know that their processes are they each have their own kits and assembly, but there is a considerable cost savings. I'm interested in looking into it more so that we just have more options.
If I may, the type of building that we're looking to do this with would qualify in those flex buildings that Anne's been talking about at the airport and in other places. These buildings can accommodate just about any use inside, from light industry to being converted into full-on office buildings if that's what somebody wanted to do with them. There's so many different manufacturers out there, hundreds and hundreds of them. And if we spell out a specification for that shell, we are very much limiting who can bid on that and what we can look at. And I really think it's worth, as we look at the properties we have to develop, I think Anne's on the right track. This is the right way to look at doing flex buildings.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Could I interject? David, I assume you have not looked at the draft scope of work and contract with Faegre, the architect that we're looking to for this project. Is that correct?
Jerry did send it over, but you are correct. I have not had a chance to look at it yet.
One of the key questions, of course, and we need your review of that scope and contract to make sure that the products or deliverables are appropriate for a design build type approach.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yep. Yeah. Happy to do that. Was this the architect? Maybe Jerry, I think might have mentioned this. There was a Pendleton project that was very similar.
Yes.
It worked on that. Okay. Yep, I can do that. Give it a review. I'll bump that up the priority chain.
Well, I think it's the procurement method is obviously important. That sets the path, but we want to make sure the first step, the architectural work, is consistent with that contracting approach, if that's the one that the commission wants to select. Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, I've kind of lost my place here. Do we expect to take this to any kind of conclusion, Michael?
Well, I mean, this is an important question to be answered about what our procurement method is. So I think we have to give it the time for Mr. Doofman to take a look at this and advise us on the correct path. And we know then what the steps are and what the timeframes are to proceed. So it sounds like this, although we'd like to bring it to you at the February meeting, it's more likely to be the first meeting in March.
All right, and just so that I'm clear, we're pursuing this on the advice of both John's experience and Ann thinking this is a better, at least a procurement.
Well, also the architect. I've known Aaron Fragery for, God, 25 years, and he is very, very good and has a lot of experience with airport projects. So this is right in his wheelhouse, and what essentially he's recommending, or is typically done for this type of project, is an alternative procurement method. So in part, it's based on staff, but also the architect's experience.
And also, if I may, in a few of the construction projects of the last few years, we have gotten stuck with some contractors that were low bid contractors that maybe we would not have chosen had we gone through an alternative contracting method based on some qualifications or recommendations. This type of contracting method would allow us to have more considerations beyond just price, and that might be that is something that the commissioners past have expressed interest in pursuing.
Okay, then we'd expect to hear back in February.
Thank you.
Yep, I can go ahead and make that, I guess, more detailed look, and certainly get back to you on the, my take as well, and maybe work with Ann to get a little more details about the project. So one quick question, I won't belabor this, but is there a date set yet in terms of when the port wants the hangar complete, or is that still being determined?
Still being determined. This is the sort of the next step. And then the commission would decide if they wanted to move forward with the construction, with the bidding, once we got that those bids back.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Good. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. In our bridge approach ramp analysis report.
Well, Harvey Kaufman Engineering is with us. And just as you recall, we have sought out Harvey's experience with bridges, movable lift spans, and major infrastructure to look in on significant analyses on the project that have a larger potential impact, either cost or risk or liability. The two that Mr. Kaufman's looked in on, of course, are the underwater pier condition. You heard a report from him prior. And then this also an important project is the condition of the approach ramps, the concrete approach ramps north and south. We did have an analysis done of those, core drills, some testing for chloride levels and other things. So the commission sought out Kaufman Engineering to take a look at that and provide recommendations. So Harvey is here tonight to describe his review of the prior analysis and testing and discuss his recommendations going forward. With that, Harvey, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Michael. Am I coming through clear?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
All right, good. So I was tasked with taking a look through your existing port bridge inspection records and identifying the condition of the existing structure, mainly the Oregon and Washington approach ramps. You have the memo in front of you here. I was going to touch on just summarizing some of the key elements of the memo. And if we have time for questions, wherever it goes from there. So having reviewed your existing information, the current condition of the bridge essentially has an issue on the approach ramps of spalling, potholes, and having to patch those on each approach. You have a previous recommendation based on the deck inspection to either do a half or full depth concrete deck replacement. This memo, my recommendation is to utilize a 2-inch asphalt overlay, a hot mix asphalt overlay with a waterproof membrane. So the basis of my my information in my report here tonight is predicated on the current bridge inspection reports, that deck inspection report, the short conversations I've had with John Mann and Michael about the situation out there. Those reports have identified you have about 3% of the deck area is either potholed or been patched, and it's identified a chloride contamination concentration above the threshold that's also present in the approach concrete deck. So I've got here references in the memo for you to consider. If we can page down to item 3. So those reports identified that you had about 3% overall damage and deterioration to the concrete deck. The Oregon approach has a little more. It's up around 6% deterioration. If you look at a model like the one WashDOT uses for their deck program, they have some thresholds here to talk about, and it's the reason why I'm reporting about the percentage of deck area that's affected here. So in this criteria, they tend to program their decks for overlays when they hit that 2% threshold. That gives them a leeway in to get that overlay in place, funded and built before the deck area hits a 5% deterioration level. The reason for that is once you get to about 5%, they found that the deck deterioration tends to drop off rapidly. That deterioration and damage gets deeper in the deck and makes the use of an overlay less effective. And now you're looking at something to be more along the line of a concrete half removal or a full deck replacement approach. In this concept, if you repair the bridge deck and the damage and deterioration of the bridge deck and put that overlay on there, you can improve the quality and condition of the deck and extend the service life to last longer. And so in this case, you're somewhere right around that level where you really want to start thinking about getting something in place to provide that overlay. So overlays, the types of overlays we're talking about here can help mitigate moisture intrusion into that deck and help smooth out that surface so the wheels ride a little smoother on the surface and protect that deck below. If we could page down to item 4. Some of the results and findings of those inspections conditions. The bridge is in a condition state that's fair according to the bridge condition code or the deck condition code. That usually runs from a value of 9 to 0, 9 being excellent, 0 being failed. That demonstrates that there's still some residual strength and capability in your deck as it sits today. The deck inspection report also identified that you had these chloride contaminations, and that's something that should be considered in a deck rehab like this. However, the reports do not identify any substantial amount of corrosion that's going on in the deck, whether it's just the inspection work didn't look for that or they were looking for other things. So it looks like there's some possibility here of an overlay being a practical solution in this case. So if you think about corrosion as 3 basic components, it takes bare metal, water with electrolytes, in this case chlorides, and oxygen to create that corrosion. You can stop that interaction by eliminating any one of those 3 elements. In this case, we're focusing on eliminating the water that assists that chloride in corroding the bar. And that's the reason for the waterproof membrane and our recommendation for a hot mix asphalt overlay. If you can page on down to item 5. So just to give you a bit of consideration in the different types of overlays that might be practical in this case, I'm promoting and recommending the hot mix asphalt with the waterproof membrane. 2 other possibilities is the latex modified concrete and the polyester concrete. Of course, there's a variation in the cost here. As you can see, these are relative material costs, but the HMA is a very low cost product, very quick to be put down and put in place. The construction cost and the cure time are a couple of considerations to think about in this type of overlay. HMA doesn't require any kind of cure time, so you can put traffic on it almost immediately after construction is complete and that mix is cooled down. Where latex and polyester have other constraints that are applicable to conditions like this in rehabbing a bridge deck. They help reduce the weight that's involved. They can also have an extended durability or lifespan that are other features that could be in play In this case, you're looking for something that's going to get you about 20 years. HMA is very capable of doing that. But with the price factor such low level, you could actually probably get away with doing an HMA twice and still be in a lower cost than the other two overlay types. And so that's the reason, part of the reason for recommending the HMA overlay. And you can see the relative cost there. The total cost I'm showing there would be for something of the magnitude of what we're looking at in this project. The deck replacement price was, I pulled that from the previous report, the deck inspection report. So it kind of gives you a magnitude of variation here in what we're talking about overall. I think the total construction cost for an HMA might be in the $350,000, $400,000 range. We could move down to item 6.
Harvey?
Yeah.
Could you just clarify that last statement you made on that chart?
Sure.
Did I hear you correctly that the roll-up number ballpark for HMA with membrane was what? 400,000?
Yeah, 350 to 400,000. I put a quick magnitude cost estimate together in the end of this memo for you, and you know, just a quick magnitude to compare, relative compared to what you've been given previously.
So am I misreading that or misunderstanding? The HMA with membrane on your chart has a ballpark of, say, call it 200,000.
Well, these are more based on a relative material cost between the three examples I'm showing here.
Okay, thank you.
So there's other factors that go into the construction of that. Some things to consider, though, in the application of an HMA in the context of the recommendation I'm providing here is to go out and put that about 2 inches of HMA on the existing structure. And so there's some things that need to be considered as a result of that. One of them is the weight of the overlay. We're talking about adding all that additional weight to the bridge, which isn't necessarily that much. And especially with the context of you have an older bridge that was designed for a lighter truck. However, I think with the weight restrictions you have in place and the weight restrictions you'll probably be putting on the structure real soon, it gives you enough capacity to absorb that additional weight on those concrete approaches. But that's something that needs to be considered in the design of this process. Expansion joints, the expansion joints would need to be modified to accept that additional thickness in the overlay. That's typical for a project like this. However, there are also some expansion joint repairs that have been identified, and this could be a time to also include those as a part of the project. The weight of the construction equipment with the restrictions around the bridge and the type of work this happens to be, you have to take a look at the type of equipment that will be used to complete the construction. Some of this equipment can be relatively heavy, so as a part of the contract in your construction contract, you want to make sure you identify and limit those types of equipment and how they're going to deliver the material on the bridge. I would, you wouldn't be able to use vibratory type compactors, which is typical today. So we have to right size the rollers to get the right compaction on the bridge without exceeding the capacity. And the last thing here is the guardrail height. The guardrail height is important in the functionality of the guardrail, and we'd want to look at the overall guardrail height and how that interacts with the additional or the reduction in the height related to the application of the HMA. There's a few other factors that play in here, but those are some of the key elements that I'm summarizing here for you tonight. So the last piece I have is some pictures that John Mann provided related to repairs he did here a couple weeks ago on the bridge. And I just want to share that with you so you get a visual idea of what you're facing. This is obviously a patch location John had taken a picture of. It looks like most of the loose and broken surface concrete's been removed. You're looking down on the concrete deck here at the top mat of reinforcement that's in that deck. And you can see the bars don't look heavily corroded at this point. There is some light corrosion on that bar. But I don't believe that's necessarily enough corrosion in this case to have caused this fall. I think that John was saying that the wheel lines are rutted, and the ruts are probably getting extensive enough where the cover here is thinned down enough where the tires are just rolling over this or breaking it up. You do see pretty good concrete here, though. The concrete that remains, the rest of the thickness of the deck is in good shape. You see some fractures in the aggregate, which is a good indication that the concrete matrix is strong enough to break the rock. So you've got pretty good underlaying concrete deck there. Another indication that it's still an appropriate time to use and utilize the overlay process and a waterproof membrane to extend the life of this deck. I think there's 3 other pictures there. They're really going to show you about the same concept. John, I think these are all cleaned out, or is this the way you found them?
That's the way we found them. And then all the little loose edges that you see were there, those all got chiseled out.
Now, is this a previous repair that has broken out?
No, you're looking at what's left of the old overlay, the last overlay we did about 6 years ago,
Okay.
which that surface just wore off so quickly.
Right. So a part of the concept here in the process is going out and checking this deck to identify any additional spalling and patching that would be needed just before you put the waterproof membrane down and put the overlay on. Once you get that overlay on top, that tends to lock the deck in, reduces the wheel pounding, it smooths that surface out so the wheels aren't pounding anymore. When you get a pothole like this, the wheels are falling in that hole and they're pounding and bouncing on that deck, and that just exacerbates the whole condition out there. So, that's a brief account of the memo I provided you. I'd be happy to discuss it further or answer any questions at this point.
Mr. Cutler, or John, one of the two, we overlaid 6 years ago and it's already falled out, but we expect 15 to 20 out of the asphalt.
So the
Well,
overlay, go ahead,
yeah,
John.
go ahead, Harvey. Go ahead, Harvey.
The overlay you have out there was more of a sealer than it was a repair. So while that was there to help seal up that concrete so the moisture wouldn't get into it, you can see that it's worn off. The wheels, more likely the studded tires are tearing that up and have removed it. So it's not effective at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is Commissioner Shepard. I seem to remember some of our presentations in the past had some of the damage was caused by the salt and the chemicals put on the roadways. How does this hold up to that?
So that's the idea behind the membrane. The chloride's in the deck and it's going to remain in the deck. You really can't get rid of that. But you need the water in there, the moisture in there along with oxygen to help create that and cause that corrosion to occur. When we put the waterproof membrane down, that seals off that deck so the water can't get to the concrete deck any further. The asphalt's naturally porous, so you've got to have that there anyways. Otherwise, you're going to hold that moisture against that concrete and it's just going to make it worse, faster. So the waterproof membrane takes care of that and prevents that water from getting down below the asphalt layer.
I guess that was my uneducated question. The asphalt is not affected nearly as much as the concrete.
Yeah, the asphalt's a little different program there in
Yeah.
that it's an asphalt base. So the water intrusion, the salt intrusion, the salt itself doesn't affect the concrete matrix. It's got to get down there and corrode the rebar. I don't know if you understand that when metal rusts, it expands by 30 times its volume. And that's what separates it. It becomes a wedge in there and separates the concrete surface from the lower layer. And that's the problem with the chlorides getting to the bar and causing that corrosion. The corrosion can happen naturally just in any water, but the chlorides tend to accelerate that because they're an ionic material.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question for Michael. We did an engineering kind of thing 5 years ago. In that projection, what was the projection of the load reduction? Was that around this time? Did we know that the load reduction was going to be now? Or is that an accelerated?
Well, I think the way I'd answer it, they're two separate issues. That was a full-on engineering analysis. It must have been $100,000. We looked at every bridge component, and then based on the engineering advice and look at different deterioration rates projected, we looked ahead and anticipated when different bridge components would need to be repaired, replaced, or modified in some way. The anticipation was, and this is an important point, within that 30-year model, what our base assumption was that this would, being on top of the bridge, making sure we're on top of every component piece and monitoring it, and putting in the requisite cost for improvements and upgrades and repairs, that the bridge could be safe and operational for 30 years. And that's still the base assumption. It requires a rigorous annual review and look at the bridge components, and it requires a anticipated increasing level of investment. But that's the underlying assumption. This particular issue about the weight reduction comes from a different quarter that Harvey can probably explain better than I can. But at a certain level, at a certain point, and I think it might have stemmed from the collapse of the Minneapolis Interstate Bridge, the Federal Highway Administration basically required each DOT to analyze each bridge within its state, and especially looking at specialized hauling vehicles, which have a high point load and lower axle count in particular. So ODOT has been going through this bridge assessment over several years now, and our time came up. So they hire a structural engineer, they look at our bridge carefully, and based on a bunch of math, they do the weight rating. And that's what happened here. They took a hard look at the bridge, and based on whatever new criteria, new concern about specialized hauling vehicles, they've assessed our bridge and determined that the limit needs to be reduced. So Harvey, if I've described that reasonably well, you couldn't anticipate in our engineering modeling that the FHA would take a hard look at the weight limits of this bridge.
I think
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
The loads have changed over the years. The bridge was originally designed for an H15 load. That's quite a bit smaller than the trucks you see, the dump trucks, cement trucks that run with 5, 6, 7 axles. And those axles are spaced very close together. And so you have the ability and capacity to put quite a bit of weight in a much shorter span. And that was just a change in the recognition of FHWA and AASHTO that needed to address those loads that could be really running down the road. And that's where this comes from. That's not predictable in your aging model or your deterioration model. That's an external loading factor that was recognized by the code.
No, thank you for explaining that. I really appreciate it.
So I guess in sum, Harvey, you've looked at the condition of the bridge deck. You've looked at different possible alternatives. We do need to implement some repairs and upgrades, but thankfully, you believe, at least at this point, that the lower cost waterproof membrane with asphalt overlay is tentatively appropriate, but contingent upon further analysis of the weight load bearing of the bridge deck and other considerations. But the next step would be to make sure that the capacity is there for this overlay and the weight, and pending that determination, and if it's positive, then this is an option, essentially the least cost option that can effectuate the repairs.
Correct. And certainly the weight is an element, and it is time to put an overlay on this deck, and that's going to extend the service life. Whether it's an HMA, that's my first recommendation. Because of the factor of the constructability and the cost, it can, they're relatively easy. However, there are other overlay options and considerations if the weight is a factor on the deck on these approach ramps. There's the other 2 options. There's a combination of 3 options there, but there's options of overlays that could be considered here for this structure. I would just promote and I believe the HMA would work in this case.
And the life of this treatment what did I read? It was 15?
15 to 20 years is what you'd expect. There could be issues within the deck. You see it on occasion that it's not going to like it. And so you might have to do some additional patching, that kind of thing down the road. But what I'm suggesting is even if that's the case, funding wise, you're still going to be quite a bit ahead of replacing that entire deck. And you're going to have the same functionality out of the bridge.
Mr. Kaufman, this is just curiosity, but would there be moisture sensors underneath the membrane? How do you know if you're getting water in there?
Well, the deck will tell you that. It'll start breaking up if you're not careful. There is a prescriptive approach in how that membrane goes down and how you prepare the surface before you put that membrane down. But it's not thin. It's a relatively thick mat of material that goes down over top of a tar coat, tack coat, and then you put your overlay on top of that. So there's a prescription that has to be followed there to make sure it's sound construction.
Okay.
The one picture that you showed had some asphalt on top of the concrete that from the 6 years ago job. Is there an argument to remove that layer to help just get down to the straight concrete?
First of all, let me clarify. What you saw there that looks like asphalt is really an aggregate that's spread into that polyester overlay. So it's relatively thin. Looks like asphalt in that picture, and I should have clarified that. It is actually not asphalt. Asphalt would have a relative thickness to it. But John has been telling me that layer is coming off, and it might need to be a part of the preliminary work before the waterproofing goes down, is to address that. If it's coming loose and not unbonded from the concrete deck, that's going to be a part of the work that's going to happen.
Okay, thank you.
It's actually, if I can just intervene here, it's actually not popping off. It's just wearing down really quickly. It just, I don't know if it's the studs, combination of studs, and then like a lot of those just heavy trucks carrying rocks that wore it down, but it's the surface is wearing down. It's still adhered well, except for the places where the delamination is broken up underneath it. So
yeah, it's still a consideration though. You want good bond between that tack coat and the waterproof membrane. It's important so it doesn't roll the asphalt on you. On a straight bridge like this, that's usually not a problem. If you get real hot weather and real hard braking, that could be a factor, but you'd see that in the asphalt itself. So more of a maintenance issue than it is a failure in the system.
So I think the commission should expect a scope of work for further engineering analysis and evaluation or determination if this is the right approach, or if not, what alternative to take on. But I think based on Harvey's recommendations, this is a project we need to anticipate implementing this year if possible. Certainly, I think Harvey checked me, but no later than next spring. And thankfully, this cure time is a lot shorter if this approach works. But unfortunately, we're going to have to find a way to, if this goes in the fall, to make sure it adapts to the harvest season that we confront every summer and fall.
I really think that you'd probably want to look at a weekend closure or a nighttime closure to put this asphalt down. I think it could happen quick enough that it could be done in a night or two's worth of work. But that'd have to be something we'd have to look at in detail. It would be relatively quick like that.
Excellent, thank you. Well, Harvey, thank you for that presentation. Very thorough and detailed. So we have a project for our capital planning list for next year.
Yeah, good news compared to our previous estimate of cost.
True.
All right.
Mr. Kaufman, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good night.
Okay, every state legislative advocacy update.
Great, thank you. Just one adjustment to the agenda. Actually, Dan Bates is not in attendance, but we do have the esteemed Miles Pengele, who's a vice president with Thorn Run Partners, and Brad Boswell, who is our government affairs representative in Olympia. Miles and I have been spending a lot of time together meeting with members of the Joint Transportation Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. And I'm looking forward to ramping up with Brad on the Washington side. So Miles tonight's going to give an update on our progress with the Bridge Authority legislation and our ongoing request for bridge appropriations to keep the engineering effort moving. But there's other issues aside from the bridge as well. So Miles, with that, why don't you go ahead and say hello and start the presentation.
Well, good evening, everyone. Nice to virtually meet you. Maybe someday eventually I'll get to come present to you in person and take the excuse to come out to Hood River for the day, but good to see you over Zoom for now. Wanted to give you a real quick update on what's going on in general during Oregon's legislative session and then get into some of the port specific stuff. This week was the first real week for the legislative session. It was delayed because of threats of violence at the Oregon State Capitol, as I think pretty much every state capitol experienced. So legislators started hearing bills this week. About 2,000 bills have been introduced, which is fewer than the usual 3,500 to 4,000 that we see in a long session in Oregon. We have gone through all of those bills and flagged all the bills that may be of interest to the port. Michael and Kevin have then reviewed our list and provided feedback, and we have a universe of bills that we will be tracking for the port. To give you an idea of some of the things that we keep an eye on for the port in the legislature, anything related to public meeting laws and public records laws. There is a lot of legislation this session raising the limitation on damages for torts of local public bodies. Search and rescue funding through the Office of Emergency Management, funding for the Columbia River Gorge Commission, how workers' compensation for COVID is going to be handled. We're following the omnibus transportation bill for the port, anything related to the I-5 bridge project, particularly anything that addresses any sort of BiState Bridge Authority. And of course, we are always on the lookout for any funding for industrial infrastructure that the port could take advantage of. And so we provide a weekly report on any legislative action on any of the bills that we're tracking for the port, and summarize any lobby activity that we're doing on the port's behalf, and then flag any bills that are scheduled for hearings in the coming week. I think Michael shared our week 1 report with you. We're happy to continue sharing those reports with you and keep you as in the loop as you would like as the session continues. This session is obviously strange because it's virtual. We're still figuring out how to lobby effectively without all the informal communication that you get with legislators when everyone is in the Capitol. The legislature still will have to vote on the House and Senate floor in person, but they will do so less frequently, which means that it's likely that they will end up passing fewer bills. Fewer bills are going to be passed and considered this session than is typical. And sort of the big picture priorities for session, the legislature is doing a lot of work to address police reform and systemic racism in Oregon's government. Obviously, a lot of attention is being paid to recovery from this season's wildfires and changes to wildfire policy to better protect against and manage wildfire moving forward. Response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and looking at what recovery looks like, both from a public health perspective and a economic recovery perspective. And then the one that's going to be most impactful to the port's interests is balancing the budget. We're looking at a $1.7 billion shortfall for the budget this cycle, which since one of the things that we're asking for the port this session is $5 million for phase 2 of the replacement bridge project, that's important context to have. So yeah, as Kevin said, he and I have been doing a number of meetings with the transportation leaders and Ways and Means budget leaders in the legislature to brief them on the state of the bridge replacement project and make the case for pursuing $5 million of funding for phase 2. We have strong support from Representative Williams and Senator Thompson. We also have the support of Representative McLean, who is the co-chair of both the Joint Transportation Committee and the I-5 Bridge Committee. We've met with the Governor's Transportation Policy Advisor, the ODOT Region 1 Director, and the Director of Major Projects for ODOT. And we're working our way through members of the Joint Transportation Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. Really positive responses so far, I would say, overall, especially considering the budget climate. People are appreciative of the importance of this project to the region and to the state overall, and understand the need to replace the bridge. The feedback that we've really heard about the money is that for legislators in Oregon to be willing to devote $5 million to this project this session, they want to see a match from Washington State, which is why we're glad that Brad is working on that on the Washington side at the same time. And then the other thing that we're talking about in these meetings and working on is the concept of this BiState Bridge Authority. We have a bill this session, which would essentially direct the Port of Hood River to work with the members of the BiState Working Group and report back to the legislature by the end of the year on the ideal structure for a BiState Bridge Authority and the statutory changes that would be needed. As much as anything, this bill is just a venue to talk about the project overall and the concept of the BiState Bridge Authority. We will likely be doing a hearing in front of the Joint Transportation Committee to talk about the project and to talk about the concept of that authority. And we're certainly talking about that concept in all the meetings with legislators when we're discussing our $5 million ask. And then just real quickly, a couple other things that we're working on for the port. There's the Hood River Stormwater Line project. The port, we worked with the city of Hood River on behalf of the port in 2019 to get lottery funding to the tune of $1.7 million for that project. That money is supposed to be released in a lottery bond sale this spring, but because of shortfalls in the Oregon lottery, they are not going to have enough money to fund all the projects that they slated to fund in 2019. So we are resubmitting our bonding request for that project, and we'll be working again with the city of Hood River to try to get more funding. The city obviously had to pay for the first stage of that project with their own funds, but we're trying to get money now for subsequent stages of that project. And then we've also been working with Michael and Kevin and the Port of Cascade Locks to secure some of the federal COVID relief money that is going to be coming to ODOT. ODOT's receiving about $120 million in federal dollars, and lost tolling revenue from local tolling agencies is one of the eligible expenditures. And that OTC is going to be in charge of allocating that money. So we'll be working with Hood River's legislative delegation to try to advocate with ODOT and the OTC to get some of that funding for the Port of Hood River. Anyone have any questions?
Allison,
Go ahead.
when you guys are talking to the transportation department, how does that work? You guys, you and Kevin go in their office?
I mean, with regard to the federal tolling money or the bridge project, or just in
No, the bridge project, as you said, you were working through, our representatives are on board, and then going through the, I guess, the boards or committees that have authority.
Yeah, so just Zoom meetings. We did a joint Zoom meeting with Ryan Winsheimer, who I'm sure you're aware, the Region 1 manager, and then their government relations director, Lindsay Baker, and Brendan Finn, who's in charge of major projects for ODOT. And you know, they mostly just want to stay up to date on what's going on with the project and what we're doing. And
but they're already aware, right? They're aware of what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely, of course. But just where we are in the project, and you know, what we're hoping to get from the legislature this session. And they, you know, they're supportive, and I think happy to not be in charge of this. So I think they should be helpful to our work this session.
Okay, thank you.
And one thing I would just add, it seems like there's a lot of support for the port or the BiState working group undertaking our own bridge authority versus trying to somehow hop on board with the I-5 bridge effort. Seems like there's been a lot of support for the single voice that's coming out of the gorge for this bridge authority. So I think that's a good sign as well. And Miles, I believe that bridge study, I think that's House Bill 3019, if I recall. So if anybody likes to track those bills from their desktop, that's a number you'll be able to enter into the various bill trackers.
Miles, if I could, just, I might have missed this, forgive me if I did, but can you just project ahead the trajectory for the study bill that we're pursuing in terms of committee review and opportunities for testimony or input and things like that?
Yeah, so we will, we're currently briefing the members of the Joint Transportation Committee on the concept, so they're familiar with it and hopefully supportive of it. And then we will get a public hearing scheduled in the Joint Transportation Committee. Certainly having a member or members of the Port Commission speak about their interest and support of a bi-state bridge authority would be helpful if we can arrange that. But that will be a good opportunity for us to be in front of most of the transportation leaders in the legislature at the same time and have a broader venue to walk through where we are in the project and where our funding ask this session fits into the larger timeline for the project, and then talk about in more detail and answer any questions that they have about how this bi-state bridge authority would function. So that will, because it's a joint committee, it's not subject to chamber deadlines. So that hearing could be any time in the next couple months. We certainly can communicate with the Joint Transportation co-chairs and share our preference for when we're hoping that bill will get a hearing. And then from there, it would pass on to the House floor and the Senate floor. And then once enacted, we'll obligate the port to produce that report and report back to the legislature by December 15th of this year.
So what you're saying is we're assured of getting a hearing in front of the JTC, but then they have to approve this and they have to recommend approval, I guess. It has to go through their committee. And then from that point, it's directly onto the floor for review and approval.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And, we got this bill drafted mostly so we could have a venue and a reason to have a hearing about this bill in the Joint Transportation Committee. I would say that the co-chairs of the Joint Transportation Committee are interested in this project and supportive of this project, and whether or not the bill passes, we can certainly arrange to report back to the Joint Transportation Committee in December or later this year on the ports and the bi-state working groups recommendations for a bi-state bridge authority. And by no means is our ability to create the bi-state bridge authority with legislation in the 2022 session contingent upon us passing this bridge authority study bill this session.
But it's much better to have the legislature ask us to report back. And so by working through each members of the Joint Transportation Committee, we're hoping that there's enough support that they see this as a positive that they should basically approve and recommend approval as a committee.
That's right.
Okay. And then likewise for the $5 million ask, what path does that follow?
So we don't know for sure. There's certainly a possibility that we could get lottery funding for that project. I think it's more likely that it would just receive general fund dollars though. And so, we'll be advocating with Ways and Means legislators. We'll be working with the Hood River legislators to shepherd that ask through the process. And essentially, that doesn't receive an official vote. That allocation will be put into an end of session funding bill that lists all of the general fund allocations and all the things that are receiving general fund dollars. And it will just be a line item in that bill with a short description of what the money is for. And so, that's really going to be a process of just keeping our advocacy continuous throughout the session, keeping that ask in both in front of legislative leadership and the Ways and Means Committee, so that they put it on that final budget bill.
Thank you.
Miles, Fred Cal here. Do you know if any tolling bills are coming forward, like out of ODOT for the Portland area or anything?
Yeah, so thank you. I neglected to mention that among the list of issues that we're tracking. We're tracking any legislation related to tolling. There will be some language in the omnibus transportation bill this session to ensure that ODOT has the necessary authority to do congestion pricing along I-5 and I-205 as they continue to move forward with that process. So we'll certainly keep the port apprised of the developments with that, although we don't expect that language is going to in any way impact the tolling authority of the Port of Hood River.
And one more question, maybe you already answered it, but with this COVID-19, all the funding going through to the state transportation departments like ODOT, you mentioned earlier that OTC, that come through OTC. Do you know, as far as whether or not any of that funding would make its way to any tolling agencies? Do you know what the time frame would be with regard to that? The meeting with OTC and going through that?
Yeah, so they are supposed to have some clarity about, they're supposed to have received the money by the end of the month, and then they'll be making decisions. When we talked to ODOT's government relations director, she said that they would be discussing how to allocate that language at the next OTC meeting. And then the OTC would be making a decision about how to allocate that money at the following meeting. I don't have the dates for those meetings in front of me, but I think it would be, that decision would be made either late February or sometime in March. I can follow up with you and let you know.
Okay,
the
thank
OTC
you.
schedule coming up.
Miles, one other quick question, if you don't mind. If the Port of Hood River wanted to ask for, I don't know, $30 or $40 million in this session, what would you say to that?
I would say that we are happy to ask for $30 or $40 million for you, Michael. But I think our goal in doing these briefings and in staying in close touch with both the Ways and Means legislators and the transportation leaders in the legislature is to keep tabs on, discussions of major infrastructure funding and whether there's a possibility of securing a larger package this session. Everything we are hearing from them is that it's a very austere budget climate and there's not going to be major infrastructure funding. But we're actually meeting with one of the co-chairs of the Joint Transportation Committee and Representative Williams next week to talk about strategy for getting money for this project. And so, I think we're well positioned to ask for $30 million instead of $5 million if those funds should, for some reason, become available, like because of federal funding over the course of the session.
Thanks.
All right, Miles, thank you very much. Appreciate you logging in and being part of the conversation tonight. Brad, are you still, I think Brad's still there. Brad Boswell is our government affairs representative in Olympia. Brad has a great relationship with Senator King and our other legislators on the Klickitat County side of the river. So Brad, can you give a similar update on the progress in Washington, please?
Sure. I'll spare the front end part of the conversation because everything that Miles talked about as far as state priorities and challenges and those kinds of things, you can just substitute in Washington and it'll be the same things. So I'll focus kind of purely on where the state is at in regards to the Hood River Crossing project. So right now, Senator King, I'm talking with him multiple times a week, generally. He is working, as you guys know, last year there was a budget line item that, while not named, moved or line itemed about $5 million from another project over in Eastern Washington. And while it wasn't named, that line item is in theory scheduled for the Port of Hood River, or the Hood River crossing. And he's working right now on the supplemental to try and get that so that it's specifically named. I want to put a little bit of cautionary note on that. In our general fund on the state side is actually in much better shape than Oregon's is, and generally I think going to be okay through this pandemic. I can't say the same thing about the transportation budget. Just like in Oregon and everywhere else, between gas tax revenues plummeting, as well as toll revenues and all the various other revenue streams that go into transportation, those have been decimated through this COVID situation. So the governor has halted multiple large projects. There is a mad scramble from most of the urban corridors in Washington for transit funding because those budgets are weak. So again, I don't. That $5 million is, hopeful, but certainly not. It's not certain at this point. But we're continuing to work with Senator King. He's doing everything he can to protect that. He is in a good position. He's very well regarded in the legislature, even though he's in the minority, and is what's called the ranking minority on the transportation committee. So he does have significant influence there. So we're going to continue to work to try and capture that resource and hold on to it and get it specifically identified towards this project. In addition, we also, just like Miles talked about, a piece of legislation. We have a meeting tomorrow with legislative staff and Kevin and Steve Siegel to just sort of get some clear parameters, but it will be kind of Washington's version of trying to identify what kind of statutory changes or evolution would need to occur to move towards a BiState bridge authority. And we're going to continue to work on that. We hopefully will have some kind of actual legislation introduced in the next week, hopefully no more than 2. And we'll continue to work through the legislative process. I want to do a little bit of caution on the actual bill itself. The legislation, similar to what Miles is talking about, is less about the bill passing and turning into law and more about a tool to go have discussions with legislators, number one, about this project and building the awareness around this project, but also to eventually the legislation turns into a budget note that will hopefully direct. We have in Washington an organization called the Joint Transportation Committee, which is sort of the legislature's transportation think tank. And ideally, this just turns into a budget note that directs them to look at, what are the statutory changes that need to be considered to create a BiState authority, as well as I'm hoping to push them into being able to look at what kind of models have been out there before. My guess is that there's other BiState bridge authority concepts or authorities out there that can be looked at as perhaps guidance for this as we move forward. The other thing that I want to flag with folks, and this is both a hopeful opportunity, but also I think it will probably be a long-term effort, but Washington is clearly embarking on the next major transportation package. Between the current needs in Washington around transportation, not least of which is obviously the Columbia River crossing, but you have multiple other bridges, including the West Seattle Bridge running right through downtown Seattle, that have to have some attention drawn to it. And so the House put out an initial proposal this week, or actually the end of last week, that was approximately $18 billion worth of spending over the next 10 years, as well as the corresponding taxes and revenue streams that associate with that. That was just a proposal, but it is in the ether. We expect the Senate to put some kind of transportation package concept out the end of this week. Senator King will have a lot of influence into that. The Senate, when they put theirs out last week, did include approximately $100 million for the Hood River crossing from the Washington. I think both the needs in state, ideally also, if the feds decide to get more serious about some sort of infrastructure package, I think you'll see both states, Washington and Oregon, ramp up their efforts around transportation packages, if nothing else, to get matching funds to capture federal resources. But all of that is going to churn in the next 2 to 4 months. I'm not sure whether they get there on a full transportation package this year, but I do believe certainly within the next 3, and my guess is in the next 2, we'll have the opportunity to be working on a major chunk of funding for this project from the Washington side. I'll probably stop there just because I threw a whole bunch at you guys. I'm sure you probably have questions, and it's probably easier to chase down whatever questions you have for either Miles or I.
Brad,
sorry.
Miles mentioned that he's hearing back from the Oregon side that they want, or at least some level of contingency on wanting to see matching funds from the Washington side, which describes a sense of partnership that they're thinking about. Does the Washington side see us in that way? That this is a joint effort, or any kind of quid pro quo going on?
They don't yet. I don't think the awareness is up yet enough on this project. Plus, the reality is for most of Washington, the I-5 bridge sucks most of the energy out of the room on any of that discussion. However, no matter what, eventually we will get into that sort of discussion and kind of the need for that partnership and both sides of the river being prepared to put resources in.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I ask a question real quick?
No, please go ahead.
On the topic of the large transportation package, I understand that the list of projects that either come in under budget or don't happen, those funds roll back into the budget. And in our region, in the last big package, there was, I think, 22 million for the overpass to Eagle Point and Bingen, which hasn't yet happened. And I don't know if it will, or if that's even still allocated to our region.
I'm unfamiliar with that project. If you can send me information on that, that actually could be valuable. I didn't realize that there was projects and funding allocation that hadn't been, or may have some question marks around it. So
yeah, I don't have the most recent update. But
was that a Port of Klickitat project, or down?
It was actually a city. It was city of Bingen that worked hard on getting it in, and they did a great job negotiating with BNSF on some issues on getting a new overpass and not losing one of their at-grade crossings. But I think maybe the project has stalled because of some private property issues. But it was a high priority project with a lot of money in our region that hasn't yet happened.
Yeah, any information you can get me on that
Okay.
will be helpful. I was unaware of that specific piece.
I'm sure Mayor Barnes will have the best update, so I'll reach out to her and ask her what's happening.
Okay, and I mean, once we do get this legislation in, we're going to be working with the Washington partners, scheduling meetings, just like what Kevin and Miles have been doing, with both local legislators and expanding out to kind of the broader, both geographic area as well as just general transportation legislators, and getting that process going forward. And working closely again with Senator King on trying to get this. He really does view this as, I'm hesitant to say this, but it's got to be pretty close to his #1 priority. And I think he probably wouldn't use this term, but I think he views this as one of his legacy projects that he really wants to see done and move forward during his career.
Hi, Brad. Commissioner Strike. Hey, going back to that $5 million line item, can you kind of elaborate on what Senator King's idea of the end user will be, as far as who will be in charge of that $5 million?
We've talked very briefly about that. His current thought process was that Klickitat County probably makes the most sense. It has to pass through some sort of Washington governmental entity, and I think they are probably in the best position to probably manage it, but that isn't set yet. And I don't know if there are preferences. I think we're working pretty well with Klickitat County, aren't we, right now?
Yes.
So if we've got a good solid partner, that's probably the path of least resistance.
We've got a good memo of understanding that lays out the work plan, which includes prioritizing the level of engineering and other work that needs to be done. So as money comes in from either Olympia or Salem or DC, we know what the next priority work is to be completed.
Thanks,
There's
Brad. I
some
appreciate it.
language in the memorandum of understanding that speaks to, who gets the money, has some responsibility as the lead agency, but all that folds into the agreed kind of priorities of how to move the project forward.
Yeah. And then ideally, if we can get this specifically identified and have that pathway, hopefully that can be viewed as the Washington match on the Oregon side. In the near term. Again, our ultimate goal is to get significantly more, but that significant more is linked to a much bigger effort and bigger issue around a lot of different projects and I want to be clear too, when we're talking about this transportation package, we're talking about very significant tax increases on both fuel, on probably going down the road. Yeah, just major fuel tax increases, and I'm sure a whole variety of other fees structures. So it will be controversial, but most people in the legislature realize the need on the infrastructure side.
Brad, a quick question. At what point would you anticipate that potential funding would be either certain or near certain? When would it be revealed as an actual line item as opposed to a subplot within anyway, what's the time?
It could be as early as next month, but hopefully by no later than the end of April, we have clarity on that.
So if there were clarity, that could help our efforts in Salem.
Yeah, we get done before or Oregon's session, I believe, and Miles can answer this, but I believe they go quite a bit longer. So ideally, he will have that tool to go and take to Oregon. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenges still, but that's what we're working towards.
Thanks.
All right, Brad, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we'll be in touch soon.
Okay, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yep.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, lot one planning overview.
Well, that's to me, this is a subject that's near and dear to all our hearts, I know. Commissioner Chapman brought this up in part because she wanted to, and I don't want to speak for her, but she wanted to make sure all the commissioners understood the various steps that we've gone through over the years on Lot 1, but more importantly, to point out that there was a presentation made and a concept plan that was offered by Key Development a few years ago. And I want to make sure the commission knew about that, understood its genesis, and then was looking at Lot 1, and we're continuously looking at it in terms of what our next steps are. So that is a main reason why it's on the agenda tonight. Commissioner Chapman, was that a roughly accurate summary?
I think so. I just, I think probably the only commissioner that knew about this proposal was Commissioner Strike. And so I figured we should have a full picture of what's been proposed, what's been discussed, and yeah, that's about it.
Okay. Well, so what I'm going to go through here is very quickly just to look back, and then we'll look at the most recent actions and then the next steps. So it's a rapid fire overview, of walk down memory lane in the first part. So this is 2006, 2005, the way to waterfront look, no Second Street, no park, no subdivision. The port's boneyard was at the corner of 2nd and 8th and Portway, where the Halyard building is now. There was, if you look to the right of Nichols Basin, you could drive down to a really rough gravel area next to the water. Next. So 2007-8, we recast the look at the waterfront, and you don't see it here, but we really started, what are the values that the commission believes reflect the community needs and the community desires? How do they see the waterfront? And we started out with values, and then we went to a concept diagram, which is shown here, and a lot of other descriptive information about next steps. A couple of things I want to point out. You see the hatched area, that's Lot 1, and that was specifically called out as a study area, and thus the hatching. And then you see the note down where the pinkish is, where the current hotel is. That was anticipation of the zone change that City Council was then to implement and change that from heavy industrial to commercial. At that point, the blue area that parallel the west side of Nichols Basin, that was also zoned light industrial as well. But what the major determination was, and Commissioner Strike will remember this, that the strategic approach was to focus on away from the water and focus on that area where the current Halyard building is, where the boneyard was, and that stretch between 8th and 2nd, including the Expo Center. That became the focus of the commission's efforts. Next. And this was, it's looking back, kind of a crude diagram, but it's pretty consequential. This reflected not only the design guidelines that the commission wanted to implement, but also a general overall transportation approach and subdivision pattern. We had the existing Expo at that time. We had the existing UTS building at that time. But what it reflected was the commission's direction based on urban design kind of best practices to move your buildings to the street, reinforce corners, and effectuate a really stout pedestrian corridor along Portway, and essentially provide almost retail type storefronts, although it's an industrial zone, and try to drive all the truck access and loading and the such to the back. You can see on here the concept for the implementation of Anchor Way. That was frankly fortunate. We received a grant funding for that, and we relied upon an easement that runs north-south Anchor Way, which is a right that we were able to inherit from the Jensen ownership there. And the other thing I'll say is that Anchor Way and the easement that you don't see that goes behind the buildings on Portway was to really try to drive truck traffic off of Portway and give essentially a backdoor access to those buildings, but still an industrial area, although where Solstice is and where the Expo building that area was actually zoned commercial, and commercial in the comp plan, which changed pretty rapidly later in the game. Next. Won't go through it, really detailed, extensive multi-year effort on IMP. The main thing is that drove essentially, call it kill rights or direction from ODOT, where they could limit curb access or driveway access, and they could essentially limit the amount of build out around an interchange. And lucky Hood River, we have 3 interchanges, so we effectively had 3 IMPs at one time. But because exit 63 is a one-way, there's only one way in and out, there's a lot of emphasis on second, and that drove a lot of transportation and traffic planning around the interchange. Next. So the commission embarked on a more focused look on Lot 1. This is the preliminary concept plan. Essentially, it was developed to really get an idea of what the build-out capacity of Lot 1 was and what a roughly approximate configuration of Lot 1 should be based on those same design guidelines, but implemented now on a more complex, larger piece of property. Important to point out here, the same putting the buildings next to the street, pedestrian environment, internal parking, the really important factor of having Anchor Way run east-west through the site. And importantly, you see the nod to the smaller commercial buildings in a row, north-south. And that was a really important factor, and frankly drove a lot from public input, longstanding public input, to diminish the heights of buildings the closer you got to the water, and really create a strong pedestrian environment that intersected or interacted directly with the recreational and bicycle pedestrian imperatives, I guess, along the water. Next. Then the commission believed that strategically it was important to focus on that edge along the Nichols Basin to, in a way, kind of set the edge, but also demonstrate to the community this really strong commitment to that head-bike corridor and water access. And you see here there's the Anchor Way in concept form, also running east-west and terminating in a pedestrian plaza, which a portion of it is there now. And now you see there's a real interaction between this phase of work and the next step, which is the waterfront refinement plan, because what you see is now fewer buildings, smaller buildings, commercial buildings along the now relocated First Street, but certainly pulling back from the event site south. So you see this broad sweep of the park or future park coming up around and having direct access to First Street. Really important urban design concept that was strongly messaged to us through the waterfront refinement plan. Next. And a lot to go into here, multi-year effort. Waterfront refinement plan was intended, and frankly, half of it was paid for by the port in order to define, and maybe not once and for all, but try to really fix on what the zoning is, what the legal and dimensional controls were, so that the port and other private investors had certainty for what context they were working within. What this shows is some sub areas that were identified within the waterfront refinement plan area that had particular focus or attention, and in most cases, specific zoning change that accrued to those specific sub areas. Next. And now here you see the concept plan that Port developed actually became part of the zoning code. This is specifically referenced in the waterfront refinement plan and reflected in the zoning code. This is a sub-area development standard for developed smaller buildings. Though the zone didn't change from light industrial, it has an overlay that effectively allows commercial or retail buildings within a very specific defined limit to be allowed. So there you see that pullback from the event site south, so that sweep of Nichols Basin Park area can confront or be adjacent to First Street. You see a relocated First Street. You see a nod to a future light watercraft facility where the Nichols Basin dock is, and that plaza at the termination point of Anchor Way is developed further, again conceptually recognizing the possibility of a public restroom at that point. Next. And so then the Nichols Basin Trail was developed. It's basically comes right out of the zoning code, which comes right out of the prior work that the commission developed, planning work. And that was constructed in about 2015, really significant public state of Oregon grant that helped build that. Next. Okay, the next major step was the Lot 1 development plan. This is where we wanted to go much further into the specific layout, utilizing those, not only the zoning code coming out of the refinement plan, but also the essentially self-imposed design guidelines. So this are just concept diagram on the left, which reflects the urban design principles, full-on pedestrian access, internal parking, buildings along the street. And you see now the addition of the so-called swerve, which runs north-south directly through Lot 1, which is not only a pedestrian bicycle corridor, but a sort of signature feature for Lot 1, which reinforces the commitment to sustainability because it's an organizing principle for stormwater collection and groundwater recharge, et cetera. And so that a lot of is behind that diagram, and it's reflected basically in the concept plan, more refined concept plan to the right. There's nothing about the location of the buildings that's in any way set. It's simply a layout. And here we have now a diminished build out, meaning the amount of square footage that can be developed, combining the main portion with the smaller, call them retail buildings along the edge. Next. I'll just put this in because it's a nod to those essentially self-imposed design guidelines that the commission said that were important and reflected community input, and it was implemented and enforced, frankly, through disposition and development agreements with individual developers as they constructed buildings in the waterfront business park. And it's a commitment to sustainability, commitment to the pedestrian environment along the street, et cetera. Next. And also a commitment to festival streets and really multi-use areas, plazas, and sometimes the street can be blocked off, a commitment to access to recreation and all that. Next. Okay, so now about the same time as we developed that last concept plan we went over, Key Development, so they retained an architecture firm in Portland and took a really hard, long look at Lot 1 from their perspective. With this, what I've pulled out are just, say, 4 slides, but this was a really detailed presentation. It was quite impressive and remarkable in the amount of time they spent. They looked at the context of the gorge and the environment and the history, and they looked at the design inspirations, design imperatives and such. So this was then presented to the commission to allow the commission at that time to see what their ideas were. Next. And so I'm not speaking for them here. I'm trying to summarize this as best I can. the table of contents is here just to show you they did a lot of work in terms of preparatory and background and research that was really quite impressive and well presented. Next. And so what these two, the next slide and this one are, is the basic layout, the sort of alternative concept plan that they derived from their work. And part of it was and they would say this is derived from what they believe in economic sort of imperative is to make this projects here financeable and market responsive. So you'll see a closer look, but there's this organizing principle, which is the Second Street overpass as a view corridor and sort of an organizing concept for the entire layout of this sort of alternative concept for Lot 1. And then what you also see is the aggregation of building of that build out, that conceptual build out of say 160,000 square feet. And now they've organized that around that corridor, and they've essentially co-located the small retail or commercial buildings in the prior concept in a larger two-story structures that both sides of the street are essentially taller buildings and denser buildings, and they have a combination of probably the ground floor retail and upper story commercial or appropriate industrial businesses. Next. And this is a closer look at that. You can see there's a lot of eye candy here, which is not a criticism, but there's a lot here that is very, very unlikely to be implemented. But you can see that organizing principle of relocated First Street, and you can see that two-sided street with tall buildings and not the shorter ones on the Nichols Basin side. The concerns about this layout are many, or at least they're important. This aggregates most of the parking in one large parking lot that borders Second. That's sort of the major gateway to the waterfront was a concern. The fact that the buildings along the east side of First Street don't conform to the zoning code, and in a way, almost more importantly, they create that taller, denser wall along the water's edge or near it that was so important to so many people before. Access, you can see access to the site is essentially a reconfiguration of the Riverside and Second intersection, which would require significant approvals and use of ODOT property. And importantly for our work, at least looking ahead, Anchor Way, that east-west extension that bisects Lot 1 is not in this in a way that would be approvable, shall we say, by ODOT or the city. So there's other issues, like I say, where the number 17 is the sort of extension of the boardwalk that extends all the way out and essentially is a very significant in-water structure that is highly likely not to be implemented. But that's just again, sort of an illustrative diagram and nod to that. Next. So this is looking back to the prior plan the port developed, which is in some ways pretty consistent with the key development plan. It has a lot of the same things, but it reflects the zoning code, the limitations defined by the zoning. It acknowledges that Anchor Way is an important component piece of any development or build out of Lot 1. And it retains that two-sided street, First Street, but recognizes the strong desire to make sure buildings along the water's edge are smaller and pedestrian scale and have a lot of pedestrians and amenities in connection to the bike path. Next. So the next step was the development of the infrastructure framework plan, which said based on that planning work, here's what we have to develop or anticipate developing in order to implement the plan. And I won't go through it. You've seen this before, very significant, probably $7 or $8 million worth of hard infrastructure. And we identified $5 or so million worth of soft amenities, increased pedestrian access, boathouse, docks, and that sort of thing. So this again reflects the organizing principle of the swerve north-south through First Street or through Lot 1, and then Anchor Way crossing through. And importantly, from a transportation standpoint, I should have said it, Anchor Way provides that alternative egress point that is just a fall on your pick issue for ODOT. They anticipate a point where that Second and Riverside intersection will be non-functional for left-hand southbound traffic. Now there was a different conclusion reached by our transportation engineer that looked at traffic, but that still remains the important limit or issue for ODOT. So then after the framework plan, of course, we worked with the Urban Renewal Agency in the hopes that this could be a very compelling argument or use for tax increment dollars, which are really poised for and intended for infrastructure that can draw private investment. Anchor Way was fleshed out in detail, at least conceptual detail in the infrastructure plan. Here's the project sheet for that, about $1.5 million. And you can see that project would be a real cornerstone for future development of Lot 1, not only from a transportation standpoint, from a utility standpoint. And I think most of you know why that project would be such an important step in organizing utilities and transportation and even transit. So that's a little bit of still a look back. But then if you go to the next one, this was a subdivision. We applied and received approval for a preliminary subdivision plan. We've talked about this. Of course, the challenge is that by entering into the agreement that would allow us to receive final plat, we would need to essentially implement at least all that hard infrastructure within 5 years at that $7 or $8 million cost. And there would probably be an expectation that there would be additional soft projects done, plazas, restrooms, access to the water, docks, things like that. So that we did receive approval, but the determination the commission discussed was that we were not in a position to move forward on that without urban renewal funding to help. Next. And I guess that's it, other than to say that as the commission knows, we've taken the first steps towards the Anchor Way more detailed description from an engineering standpoint and a cost update. And we've also started discussions with ODOT, Business Oregon, and the Economic Development Administration for grant approval. We've also started discussions with CAT and MCED because they believe there's potentially a significant opportunity for grant funding from a transit standpoint. The ODOT Business Oregon discussion is for an immediate opportunity grant called the Immediate Opportunity Fund, an IOF grant, and they are very positive about that. We received one prior for the work done on Anchor Way, which is really helpful. The preliminary discussions with EDA, they saw that prior $500,000 grant for the waterfront subdivision, which improved Portway, put in the turnaround at the end of Portway by the hook, and was a component financing piece for Anchor Way. They see that as a huge win. It was a private investment that stemmed from, and that was just a part of it, but from their investment was, currently we're somewhere around $75 or $80 million. So they're pretty keen on taking another look at this next phase 10 years later. So that's the work that's underway, and I hope to have something to show you on Anchor Way at the next meeting. I don't know if that was too fast or too slow, but that's that's kind of all I have right now.
Michael, I thought that was excellent. I had no idea that much history, and your command of it's impressive. Going back to 06.
Well, I kept looking at Fred because he shakes his head over the never-ending work on Lot 1, but that's from a budget perspective. So Commissioner Strike, you've seen all this. I don't know if I missed anything important or.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Michael, that was impressive. Walk down memory lane. A lot of hard work's gone into that. It's not something we've taken lightly. We've thought about it. We've had a lot of community activity input. It's not, hopefully it hasn't gone unnoticed, but we'll just keep plugging along, Mike, and someday maybe we'll have Lot 1 completed.
Early started. I just need a little place for my ashes to be distributed. Maybe I could just add a couple things. There's been talk over the years about switching zoning. So you take zoning at, say, exit 62 and you swap it out for zoning at Lot 1. That would bring commercial zoning to the waterfront in a big way. That at this time is essentially a non-starter because it just drives up the traffic volumes significantly. And ODOT, remember, ODOT really has a lot of control over what happens around their interchange from a traffic and an intersection capacity standpoint. So we've looked at that several times, and it just doesn't seem possible. So anyway, that's a little add on there. So Commissioner Chapman, I hope that hit what you wanted to. The work that Key Development prepared was impressive. The derivations they used was really a remarkable piece of work. Many of the things they concluded from a kind of a pedestrian environment, focused on sustainability, access to the water, all that was really consistent with what the port was working on. It's really that fundamental reconfiguration of the concept layout for Lot 1 that was different for the reasons that I pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was it's a good overview. And there was one plan that I had seen that included kind of an in situ compound down there that I didn't see in that program, but maybe I'll have to ask Key or Claudia if I could get a copy of that, and I can just share it with the commissioners, because that one seemed to, I think after they received feedback from you on why their plan wouldn't work so well, they went back and tweaked it a little bit, and it seemed to be a little bit more in line with what you were looking at. And so I'll dig that up and I'll send it on over, but otherwise, yeah.
Okay. So unless there's questions or if there's a need for further discussion, that concludes my presentation.
I'm seeing no questions. That would move us on to the executive director's report. Michael, you're on again.
Commissioners, there's a written report in your packet. I think it fleshes out and identifies the most important things to keep you updated on. And I will, if there are any questions, I'd be glad to entertain them.
No questions for Michael? Okay. Then on to the committee reports. We've got urban renewal. Commissioner Strike and Meriwether.
Well, we had a meeting earlier this month, and essentially it was strictly for the purpose of naming a couple of people to the advisory committee, and the two incumbents, Amanda Bilkey and Jack Trumbull, were reappointed to another 4-year term. And I think we'd already talked about from the preceding month about the move on the part of urban renewal to dedicate all remaining taxing authority or funds from the taxing authority within the district to the storm drain project. They are asking that coupled with if they get the funds from the legislature that they had hoped to get, the city, that our lobbyists talked about earlier today, if those two in combination will take care of the storm drain thing. If they do not get the appropriation from the state, they will then consider increasing the taxing authority of the district, which means going out for a major amendment has to be approved by at least 50% of the taxing agencies that are due funds from the district. If that occurs, though, then Commissioner Strike and I raised the possibility of asking for more of an increase in the available taxing authority than just to cover the storm drain project. Now, whether or not specifically being dedicated to law, that I'd have to say there was a roaring silence on the part of our other urban renewal board members with regard to that, but we'll see how that goes. But I think it's pretty likely if the state comes up with the funds to essentially make the city whole with regard to the storm drainage project that's being worked, then I don't think they're going to have much appetite to go out and try to increase the available funding of the district. That'd be my read on it. Commissioner Strike may have a different perspective.
No, I agree with Dave. Job well done. Dave's referring to those lottery funds that were not allocated out. And so they're still in jeopardy, as our lobbyists from Thorne talked about. But yeah, basically the allocation of funding for the indebtedness for renewal as it stands on the waterfront is going to be dedicated to the stormwater project. So we have to come back up and be a little more creative with our funding for infrastructure for lot one.
Well,
well
and
done,
I think
David.
what we're doing with regard to the road extension, I think we've already authorized to move forward on Hangar Way. I think that's the sort of thing we're looking at. If we're going to develop lot one, we're going to have to do it incrementally and probably do it ourselves. Figure out ways to do it. There may be grant funds and other sources, but I don't think urban renewal would be a source of funds.
Just a quick question of one of you. I had recalled that statute allows a one-time plus up in the maximum indebtedness for the district that didn't require approval or buy-in from taxing jurisdictions. And that plus up was fairly modest relative, but it was on the order of $1.5 million or so.
Right.
Did I misremember that?
No, that's a modified version of it, yeah, which is pretty easy to do. But at this time, I think Dave will support this too, that I don't think the majority of the board is willing to address that, look at it this time. Is that fair to say, Dave?
Yeah, I think so. And frankly, just so we all understand it, I think part of it is that the city council, which of course 7 of the 9 members of the urban renewal board or city council members, the way the whole thing played out with regard to the storm drain, I don't think endeared any feelings toward lot one. So it's just unfortunately the way that came about. So
thanks.
Okay, are we done with that? Any action items? We have none. Commission calls. Any commissioner have an issue they'd like to bring out? And we do have a short executive session. Do you want to take a break or should we just go through it?
I'll just need to, if you want to recess into executive session, do you want me to read the statute number?
No, I think I have it down here.
John, can I interrupt?
Sure.
Apologize. Was there commission call is on the agenda? Was it? Do you want to do a commission call?
I did. Maybe I blew past it too fast. I would do a commission call again in that case. Yeah. Any commissioner have anything they'd like to bring forward?
All right.
Michael, do you have something you want to bring up?
No, 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 sir.
All right. Then then yeah, you want to take us, I guess I'll recess regular session. You can get us off live stream, Genevieve?
Yep, you just got to read the statute number.
Okay, and we'll go to executive session under ORS 192.6602E, real estate negotiation.